All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about are web fonts or web typefaces. And while you should always try to avoid using serif fonts, unless they're really sharp and easy to read, mobile has advanced enough so that you can be more creative with type, but you still need to keep things as simple as possible. So if you look at the two typefaces, the one on the left, hard to read, the one on the right, easy to read. And 9 times out of 10, sans serif typeface works better than serif typefaces on a screen. Speaking of screens, when you look at body copy on a screen, it will look smaller than body copy on a printed page. So that's why you need to make the body copy bigger for a screen than you do for a printed piece. So if you look at the image on the left, that is body copy that is displayed on a screen, and it's 16 pixels per inch. But if you look at the comparison on the right hand side, that's a printed page, and as you know, body copy for a printed page shouldn't be bigger than 11 point text. And so you can see the comparison, they're pretty close to the same size. So think about 16 pixels per inch for the body copy when you are designing. Now here's an example of a responsive design, the full computer desktop computer design versus the mobile design. And you'll notice that they have things like H1 and P on here. H1 is an HTML tag that means the largest header type on in a design, and a P tag is body copy. And if you see things like M's, an M is based on the size of the body copy. So body copy at 1M would be 16 pixels. And if you look at it compared to the mobile design, notice that the same typeface seems a little bit bigger in the mobile design than it does on the desktop. Here's an example of the just not changing any typeface sizes for mobile on the left, and then making slight adjustments to the header sizes on the right so that they're a little bit smaller and easier to read on a mobile device. But notice that the body copy still stays the same no matter if it's on a desktop or if it's on a mobile device. So here's an example of the design adjustments for the different types of header tags, going a little bit smaller in the mobile design. When designing type, you don't want to have type that doesn't have enough contrast. If you look at the type at the top, it has a little less, it's not like 100% black, and that's because 100% black on a white background can be a little bit too hard to read on a mobile device, and so they kind of gray it out a little bit. But something too gray could be hard to read. So if you kind of look at the body copy sizes, they are 87% gray, so they're a little bit darker, but they're not 100% black. When designing columns, you want to make sure that you're avoiding leaving large gaps and orphans on a line. Try not to leave very short words such as prepositions at the end of a line. A well-considered line break can avoid hyphenation of words altogether, and a lot of hyphenation is hard to deal with. In turn, width of columns make things easier or harder to read. So for a desktop, they like to have things about 60 characters wide for easy reading, and for a mobile device between 30 and 40 characters wide for easy reading. Now when we're designing our static designs, we'll be using Photoshop, and we'll be using an iPhone 6 canvas in Photoshop. But if you look at the size of an artboard in Photoshop that is set for an iPhone 6, notice that it's 17.25 inches wide by 30 inches deep. Now that's really huge. That's not the size of an iPhone. The iPhone is actually 2.7 inches wide by 4.8 inches deep. But what Photoshop is trying to deal with is the fact that Photoshop is set at 72 ppi, where in in the Retina display of an iPhone is 401 ppi. So making that canvas really big at 72 ppi is actually going to shrink it down and shrink down the pixels so that they're sharper pixels. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. On the right we have 72 ppi, and this is body copy, 16 pixels. On the right we have 401 ppi. In order for it to be the same size as the 16 pixels, we have to up the size to deal with the smaller pixels. So if we zoom into these pixels, you can see the 72 ppi pixels are a lot bigger than the 401 ppi pixels. They're a lot smaller, crammed in tighter. So when developers are designing for apps and mobile devices, they up the size of the type when designing in Photoshop 3 times bigger. Now it says 3 times bigger here, but we have found that between 2 and 3 times bigger, that range is a good range to be in when designing in Photoshop. So here's some examples of different sizes, H1, H2, H3. These are, again, HTML code for different sizes of headers. H1 is the largest header and H6 is the smallest header. And then P's are paragraph sizes. So let's look at the column or the row that says phone. And so for an H1, they say 32 pixels is a good size for mobile. And then if you up that 3 times, that would make it 96 pixels. So you'd have to design a 96 pixel header in Photoshop. Now, as I said, it can go between 2 and 3 times. So the range would be between 64 pixels and 96 pixels. That would be a good range for the largest header in your design. And then line height, which is leading, it's the space between lines. They're saying about 40 pixels in line height, and that 3 times that would be 120 pixels in line height, designing it in Photoshop. So we go down, then we get down to paragraph styles, and again, there's still 16 pixels. 3 times that would be 48 pixels, but you could also kind of go between 32 and 48 pixels when you're designing in Photoshop and still have a fairly close size to body copy size. Now, when you're designing, for mobile, you don't want to design any typeface that's smaller than 12 pixels. And so what would be 12 pixels? What's the smallest type on a page? Probably your copyright information would be the smallest thing on the page. So don't design anything smaller than 12 pixels. That being said, that 12 pixels, you would have to double that to be designing it in Photoshop between 24 or tripling it 36. So when you're designing in Photoshop and you're designing the smallest typeface in your design, you want to be between 24 and 36 pixels. The next section is usability, and before we get to the next presentation, I want you to watch the next video in today's lesson plan.